We spent a lot of time at TPPF writing white papers about policies and working, especially in the last year and a half or 2 years, more and more on message testing and how to communicate those white papers and those ideas ever more. Not just for ourselves, obviously, but most importantly for the policymakers who are always looking for better ways to message good ideas, and for the people of Texas. And we're fortunate, to say the least, to have two people in America, in the conservative movement, who really are at the top of the list when it comes to articulating conservative values about limited government, fair taxation, opportunities, especially for the young. And I think that given their careers, those of us coming behind them, hopefully for some span of time, thinking about Rob's work, are able to do what they've been able to do, to build on the work that they've done, as we look at, as I mentioned yesterday, what we consider the Texas century. So it's a great pleasure to introduce our two speakers. I'll introduce them and then ask them to come forward. First, Senator Jim DeMint represented South Carolina in the U.S. House as well as in the U.S. Senate. He's known for being a policy innovator, having authored leading conservative reforms in healthcare, education, taxes, and entitlements. He garnered national acclaim from conservatives for leading efforts to ban congressional earmarks, which had been the source of billions of dollars of wasteful spending for decades and led to corruption and widespread abuse. You know him as the founder of the Senate Conservatives Fund. You know that he was president of the Heritage Foundation, and now he's currently the chairman of the Conservative Partnership Institute in Washington, an organization that, among other things, has made it possible for TPPF to be present there. Senator DeMint, welcome.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks, Coach.
Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, we know, is a bold, determined, principles-first leader who consistently articulates the values and views of Texas. He was first elected lieutenant governor in 2014, re-elected in 2018. He's committed to reducing taxes, limiting government spending, border security, protecting life, the family, the Second Amendment, and education reforms. Governor Patrick is a successful small businessman and radio host. He and his wife, Jan, have been married for 43 years, have 2 children and 5 grandchildren. Please join me in welcoming Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick. All the way down to your left.
Yeah. Are you in the middle?
Yes, sir. I'll sit in the middle.
Thank you all.
Well, gentlemen, thanks for being here with us. For one of you, it was a little bit shorter trip, but I know, Senator DeMint, you're always happy to come to Texas.
I sure am.
And I know that our audience here, including some folks who are joining online, are really curious what the two of you are going to talk about. And so what I started telling people this morning is that this is going to be a session on conservative virtue signaling. Mm-hmm. In other words, we're going to talk about some policy. We're going to start with federalism here in a little bit and talk about some specific policy objectives on which the two of you have worked and led. We're going to talk about, in particular, Texas, which makes sense, Governor Patrick. But where we want to take this conversation over the time we have is to talk about the future of the conservative movement. And we want to do that for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think we always need to be thinking about how we can be better at communicating. And I think all of us have learned from the two of you about how to do that. But secondly, I think we're at a crossroads in Texas and in America. When, if we look at demographic changes, and by that primarily I'm thinking about different views between older Americans and younger Americans, it's getting harder and harder for people who tend to believe what we believe to understand the policies that we're trying to promote. And I think our state legislators from up the road would say that as well. So I'm hopeful that y'all can give us some wisdom when it comes to that. So at TPPF, as you know, we ventured into Washington, D.C., perhaps against our best judgment. And I made this really faulty prediction that we just have 2 or 3 people there in a year. As you know, Senator, we've got 14 colleagues there, and that's because of the opportunity. And so as we touch on this first topic of federalism, given your experience in the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate, and now having led a couple of very important institutions in the movement in America, I'm curious if you would, for us, just give us an assessment of the state of federalism right now in the United States.
Great question, and it's
it's easy to talk about federalism in relation to Texas public policy because of that relationship of the state and the federal government. It's great to be with all of you. Landing here in Texas is like coming home. I've got so many friends here. It's great to be with former colleague Phil Graham, who's here, has done so much for Texas and our country. And so thanks for having me back. We need to remember that America is the most successful country in the history of the world. And we need to understand why that happens. And if we don't know what made us great, we have no idea how to keep it great. And one of the fundamental things that is so different about America is that we are a republic. This federalism comes from the idea of a federation of states that came together for mutual interest, mutual defense. But the idea has always been that states would be autonomous in a lot of ways, develop their own policies, and help keep the federal government accountable. To answer your question, this has been trending in the wrong direction for a lot of years. More power moving to Washington, more money. That's why you have 40 or 50,000 lobbyists there, because that's where the money is, that's where the power is. And the special interests want more than anything else to be able to direct the whole country from Washington. The good news, though, in the middle of this trend is that more and more states are seeing that what Washington does doesn't work for them. And we've got more and more states, and I think Texas is the leader there, with great policy organizations that are pushing their states to have more choices in education, more energy competition. Texas public policy has been a leader for decades, back to right to work and a lot of things that have really helped the federal government see several things. How to do it right, just like with criminal justice reform, and we can talk more about that, but to show the federal government they don't need to do a lot of things because states can do them better. And the other, and the other thing which is important to us, and I hope you realize the gravity of this, is you are setting an example for other states on how to do things. And while California and a few other large liberal states are pushing this country to the left, Texas is the state that we count on as a country to push our country in the right direction. So what you do here is not just about Texas. And now that's why I'm so glad to see you involved in Washington, because you took your criminal justice reform, you brought it to Washington. Brooke enlisted a lot of us to help get that done, and we've set an example for it. So federalism is the way to keep our country free. And to do that, we need strong states pushing back against the federal government, and Texas is leading there.
Agreed. So Governor Patrick, as I'm sure you know, because you're such a wonderful student of history, and that's coming from a history teacher. In Federalist Number 9, James Madison said that federalism does not at all imply the abolition of state sovereignty. Rather, it emphasizes that states are constituent parts of the federal sovereignty. I think not only is Texas a leader in understanding that, but I dare say you in particular are very important and vocal when it comes to that. Same question for you as I asked Senator DeMint. From your different perspective as Lieutenant Governor of the state of Texas, the best state in the country.
Absolutely.
Sorry, Senator. You second best state.
It's a little Texas.
Yes, there you go. That's good. Earlier, we were known as a different South Carolina. But from your perspective, sir, what are you seeing that would be the most challenging aspects to understanding federalism? And then we're going to talk about some opportunities a little bit later.
First of all, thanks to you, Kevin, and TPPF for having this entire event. I want to thank my senators who are here today, who are the tip of the spear, and our House members. And you have 14 people in Washington, but the most important person is Brooke Rollins. She's 3 doors down from the president. And she's now pretty much the de facto head of domestic policy. I want you to think about that, because some of you who are here were here in the beginning when this started as a small organization and has now become the preeminent conservative think tank in the country. And without all of you here today, and I know I'm going to be talking to the visionary group a little bit later, but without all of you here today, if you listen to, and it's an honor to be on the stage with the senator, what he just said. And that is, the way Texas goes, America goes. So you are a vital part of making that happen. Without you, there would be no TPPF. Without TPPF, there would be less conservative legislation being passed. We are at a crucial point in our history where if we would lose the election in November to the left, there are going to be a lot of people in Texas starting to think of, do we want to be a country again? Because what they are positioning as their total platform is dangerous for the future of our grandchildren, our children, and ourselves and our economy. Dangerous. So we in the Senate have embraced this idea of we know what we do matters to the other 49 states and the world. And so we do not take our responsibility lightly. And when leadership comes in January in the House, I hope they will view it in the same lens, because we don't pass a bill without realizing that it's a good chance that it could become national policy, whether it's education on the textbooks and how that will reflect national policy, whether it's on the bill we passed this session to end surprise billing, whether it's the bill we passed this session that put a cap on the increase in drug prices, which is now the tightest cap of all 50 states to bring down the cost of health care. We take that very seriously. And if I didn't have a strong team of 19 Republicans, and it takes 19 votes to bring a bill to the floor, 16 to pass. So I'm right there at that number. And if we lose 1 or 2 seats, maybe we might have to go to 16 next session. And I'm saying that because I know the media is listening. We might have to go to a simple majority, because we will not be stopped in leading on federalism for the United States of America, because the country depends on it and we depend on it.
Governor Patrick, I think you might have just made the news.
Well, thank goodness it wasn't me.
Your turn's coming, Senator. Your turn's coming.
And the day's not over.
That's right. Golly.
Well, we went from 21 to 19. Why did we do that? I fought for that change in that blocker bill from the time I was a freshman senator, because we were the majority, but we allowed the minority to overrule us. If we are still the majority, but the minority has the power to overrule us, we cannot let that stand. There are some members in the Senate that forget the days when they had to go to a Democrat to get permission to bring a bill to the floor. I remember, I was there. I don't want to let that happen again. But we're going to be successful in November. The president's going to win, Cornyn's going to win. We're going to keep the House, and we're going to keep a majority in the Senate.
Thank you. I appreciate what you said. I'm going to swerve back into 501c3 land.
I know, I'm sorry. Blame it all on me.
At 5:31, I can give you a high five.
Okay.
Senator, no, you're fine, sir. We're just having fun. Senator DeMint, I want to home in on one of those examples of a policy that started in the state, in this case Texas, and color me biased, but it started at TPPF and other people, some in this room, Doug Deason, Brooke Rollins not in this room, some of our criminal justice advocates here, Mark Levin I haven't seen yet. They really put together this idea. Governor Perry signed on, some members of the legislature to criminal justice reform. You were one of the early signatories to this concept of what it meant to be a conservative in support of criminal justice reform. And there are a lot of people in this audience who are familiar with that, but there are a lot of people, because there are a lot of new faces here, who are less familiar with that. They know how we at TPPF would describe that. But what about giving us your perspective from outside Texas, from someone who saw this evolve?
It was a fun project to be a part of, because it is something that I've worked on and brought up, but really never had the horsepower to get done in Washington before. But I knew from being a volunteer businessman years ago in South Carolina that we had so many people in the criminal justice system that were good people that couldn't get out, that were in for nonviolent offenses. And as a Republican, you don't want to be soft on crime. But at the same time, it doesn't make sense when practically everyone in prison is going to get out, and we were doing nothing to prepare them to live outside. So we were exacerbating the problem. So when TPPF took that on and Brooke came to Washington, she was working with Jared. She talked them into doing this. He was interested in it because Jared Kushner's dad was in jail. But Brooke had me walking around Congress with Van Jones. Do any of you know who he is?
Did you enjoy that?
I did. He turned out to be very likable. That's why my staff never wants me to meet people that I shouldn't vote with because I like them. But
that's because you're likable.
No, but Van was right. He said, this is a trust builder. It's not going to solve anything. But the reason we were walking around is to stun people, because all the conservatives, they weren't going to vote for it because they didn't want to look soft on crime. So they thought if I was for it, it might help. And if all the liberals wouldn't vote for it because they didn't want to give Trump a victory on anything, but Van helped to do that. So that pair walking through the Capitol, speaking to conservatives and liberals, it was fun to see the shocked faces in the room. But the reason it worked, it wasn't emotion. Texas had done the dry run. They had done the reform here. We had seen that what people said, that we were letting violent people out of jail, was not true, that there was actually a reduction in recidivism and other things. It worked. And so we could take that data to Washington, and having the horsepower of Texas behind us and a few other states that had followed your lead, it was something that was worked very hard and pushed through. But again, because Brooke is right down the hall, and Jared turned out to be just an excellent listener and facilitator to the process, we actually got something done in Washington that I think will help. Now, I know the federal government will mess it up in the implementation, and you'll see all kinds of news reports, but it's actually going to work, and we've had so many people already who've had great stories to tell. So it makes me proud to be a part of something that can work. But it started in Texas, it started at the state level, and you showed Washington it could be done.
Sure. And it's sort of like what Justice Brandeis said in the 1930s, that states are laboratories of democracy. Right. And you and Governor Patrick, you talk about this often, that if California wants to do something crazy, which I'm told sometimes they do, that's
all the time.
All the time, yes, sir. Let them do that. But here in Texas, let's sort of right the ship, and then let, in this sort of ecosystem of policy innovation, if that's what California's doing, let's let the best policy win. So kind of coming back here to Texas, Governor, I'm curious, in your crystal ball, thinking about policy priorities that you may have, thinking about all of the policy reasons that people want to move to Texas. So that is, aside from the fact that summer here is awesome. The regulatory...
Is that why they're coming?
Definitely not to Houston. Regulatory environment, taxation system. We often, I think in Texas, take for granted that this huge problem we have in DC with the administrative state, huge problem. We're seeing that on display in the well of the Senate right now. But here in Texas with the Sunset Commission and some other laws, that while it's not yet perfect, we at least are in better shape. My point is, as you look into your crystal ball for 2021 and beyond, what's the next criminal justice reform? What's the next policy innovation that's important to you and to Texans that can start here and maybe take the world by storm?
Well, I think we have been leaders on education. I think we can continue to do that and broaden those horizons. I was privileged to be asked to go to the White House in December and meet with the president and the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, because they have enacted many reforms and some really, really incredible young people who have had opportunities that many others don't have. And so the president is really going to be focused on this, I believe, this fall. And we need to be the leaders on that. You know, we have more students in school in Texas, about 6 million, than half the states have people. So what we do really matters. And so that's one area. I think the healthcare issue is going to be the key. I was talking to our chairman, Lois Colcourse of Health and Human Services, and Charles Perry this morning driving in. He's on that committee as well, talking about what we can do to help shape Washington's policy. So that we have the freedom that we need and the resources that we need for a growing population. So I really think healthcare is that issue. And what the senator said, I know in criminal justice reform, and I'm very, very careful never to say anything in a private conversation that I've had with the president. And because he comes here a lot, and because I won't talk about campaigning, but because I'm the chair of his campaign, we visit a lot. And on the criminal justice reform, what we did in Texas really influenced him.
Sure did.
It really influenced him because it's you know, if Texas has thought this through and moved on these issues, then that speaks volumes. And so, but I think healthcare is the key issue because that threatens to bankrupt all of us.
Sure.
And it's important to everyone.
Sure. I mean, most importantly, from a day-to-day perspective, from a policy perspective, and just saying this as an observer, not as a partisan, at least at this moment, it's also really important to campaigns and elections. So people who are paying attention to that, districts will be won or lost by particular parties because of that issue.
Real quick, our budget, if you just looked up, if you had my imaginary, some of you have seen my presentation, my imaginary clock behind me, our state budget from midnight to about 6, almost 7, is what we spend on education. So more than half of our budget is spent on education, the vast majority of that K through 12, and then higher ed. From 7 to 10 on the clock is what we're now spending on health care, if not more. And from 10 to 11 is what we spend on public safety. From 11 to midnight is all we have left for everything else. So health care at one time used to be, 10% of our budget. Today it's approaching a third of our budget or more. And what happens when the hands go past midnight? You're spending more than you have. So you either have to wind the clock back or you have to raise revenue, which means raising taxes. And that's something that I'm proud we have not done in Texas. We have cut taxes since 2015 when Governor Abbott and I came in and the Senate and the House. We've cut taxes by $6.2 billion in Texas, mostly through property tax, and we've increased spending for TxDOT from $23 billion to $31 billion without any increase in taxes or fees. So you can reduce taxes and meet the needs if you think conservatively. And that's what we've been doing, and we have to keep on that path.
We've been living past midnight for a long time
Yes.
in Washington right now.
The hands on the clock are going like this in D.C.
Back in the 1830s, we needed some folks to come to Texas, and now y'all need some Texans to go to D.C.
Yeah.
Exactly right.
Yeah. And thanks to President Trump for seeing that.
That's right. He did.
And the
To your
influence
point.
the influence that Rick Perry had on beyond being energy secretary.
That's right. It's not an overstatement. Right. Even accounting for Texas bravado, it's not an overstatement.
Yes.
So, Senator DeMint, I wanted to follow up on this really important issue of health care. And it's a little bit of a think tank question on the policy side, but of course there are political implications. And my question for you is, the speculation is nothing's going to happen this calendar year in Congress, but is there something from your perspective as now a policy leader that states could do on health care at the state level that would help keeping that clock from going past midnight?
I think you can look at options. For instance, on Medicaid. Medicaid often traps people in a program. States could begin to convert part of that if people wanted to gravitate into private insurance if they got a job. Don't take it all away from them. Allow it to help subsidize to transition out of it. Direct primary care, which is it's kind of a membership thing where primary doctors can say you pay $50 a month and you can come. States can push that idea. There'll be insurance companies here in Austin saying that's an insurance plan that has to follow, so you have to push back against that. But begin to give people all the choices that you can and keep lobbying the federal government to allow more flexibility in how policies are shaped. Because if someone who could have a few $1,000s in a health savings account over several years and then just have a catastrophic policy and use their health savings account to pay for health care, there are a lot of things that we can do to give people the options. But what happens in Washington is they say, well, that's not fair for you to have that when somebody else can't afford it, so everybody has to be on a government plan. But what happens if we allow the flexibility, then a lot of private plans become less expensive and more available to folks at the lower income level, and then you can use state plans and federal plans to help them pay for it. But what we want to avoid is every American who's pushed on a government plan They're inefficient. What I'd like Texas to do is to just fight for more block grants for Medicaid and get things back in the states, show that you can do those programs better, and then other states will follow, and eventually, hopefully, we can get the federal government out of that.
And we're doing that for sure. We're doing that.
But if I can interject, from my perspective, working around the whole country, is education savings accounts or scholarship accounts, which about 10 or 15 states have done. Florida has innovated in a lot of ways. They've moved into this area. Creates a personally guided account for parents to choose a wide variety of education. Right now, you can only put the state portion in there, but the more states do that, the more they'll push for the federal portion. But what I believe is if you had children running around with $8,000 or $10,000 in their account every year, it would attract so much capital, non-government capital, to the education field to create all kinds of alternatives. So I've been to Texas on a number of trips, encouraging Texas legislators, senators, to keep working on that idea, because if Texas had education savings accounts, it would go across the nation immediately. And that's where, with probably over half of your students in elementary school are Hispanic, a lot of them, I mean, what we need them to do is to have freedom, to have a better education and more opportunity. And then I think they'll learn that maybe it's Republicans and conservatives that are actually trying to make their life better.
Because the whole genesis of our movement is people. We care about people. So we'll move on to border security here in just a moment, but if I were writing a headline on what the two of you just said, tell me if I'm mistaken, it's that in the most expensive parts of the Texas budget and also the federal budget, if you count for healthcare, so education and healthcare, regardless of how great the healthcare is, regardless of how great the education is, we have the worst, most expensive delivery systems for those two things, and it's time for them to change.
Right.
Good.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you want to provide the services. We want to have the best education system. We have to live within our means, and the only way you can live within your means is to be very smart about how you spend their money. And we forget, and I don't want to stray across that line of politics here, but we forget that as conservatives, we have only been in charge of the state since 2003. There was Bill Clements, there was George Bush, but there weren't conservatives leading the House or the Senate. So we've only been around for 8 or 9 sessions. And we have gotten very comfortable in our leading the way because of you, because of the voters, because of TPPPF, all working together. And we cannot take that for granted. And it could end like that.
Sure.
It could end like that.
And unfortunately, one example of Texas having to be very vocal about its own sovereignty, properly within federalism, is on the border.
Right.
The Senate, of course, the state Senate passed a resolution declaring a border crisis. You've been very vocal on that. Governor Abbott has been in the news recently on the refugee settlement question. I know a lot of our attendees, Governor Patrick, are curious to hear from you what your assessment is of border security on the Texas border.
Well, quickly on this issue. So when I won the election, but I was not in office yet, before the inauguration, I met with our Steve McCraw, who's our director of DPS, and I asked him what they needed for the border. Because, remember, we've been rotating state troopers down there and pulling law enforcement from elsewhere around the state. And while we still do that at some level, we're building a couple of hundred new troopers from that area, in that area, putting a new ranger company there. But he said, look, here's what I need, and that added up to about $800 million. I said, okay, done. And we have put that in our budget every session. Now, that's something the federal government should be picking up. We shouldn't have to do that, but until the federal government, and finally under President Trump, they are moving in that direction. But we're going to have to continue to do that because it comes to law and order, it comes to safety and security. So we spend that money. And by the way, one of the things that we did, and this is just smart thinking, we were about 800 troopers short of what we should have per capita according to law enforcement. So part of that 800 million, about 250, 300 million of that, is we increased the workday of our troopers from 8 to 10 hours a day. That was the equivalent of putting 600 more people on the street in terms of man hours. Now that may not seem like much, but it worked. And I went to the troopers, I went to the officers first and said, look, are you all good with this? Because they have to have buy-in. They are good with it. They were working a lot of those hours anyway. And so that's one thing we did. We have more boats on the water than the federal government. We have more planes in the air than the federal government. And I was down in Dilley, Texas a few weeks ago to see that federal facility. When I see those who say we have people living in crates, if you went down there and visited the facility, which is for moms with children who have come here illegally and are awaiting asylum, it's one of the premier facilities anywhere in the country. Maybe better living conditions than many of them had for most of their lives. This president, working with us on this issue, has done an incredible job. For example, in that Dilley facility, at the peak of the crisis, they were processing 165 people a day. It's down to about 30. His MPP Act, the new Protocol Act, that says if you try to get asylum, you have to wait it out in Central America, has discouraged a lot of people from coming. Even if you come from Mexico now across the border seeking asylum, they send you to Central America, not back to Mexico. So our illegal border crossings are down about 70%. We need people. We are a nation of immigrants. We all know that as Republicans. We know that, but you need to come here legally. And with the president, Texas has really made a big difference in that. So I'm proud of where we are. And every session I get pushback, well, we could use that $800 million on something else. This is really important to have a secure border. And it's important, by the way, with people in all parties and all walks of life. And quite frankly, a lot of the border towns now down, they're some of the safest areas in the country. There's so much law enforcement there.
It's an existential threat, most importantly to the rule of law, which is what our system is based on.
Right.
So, Senator, I would like to use this issue of border security as a way of transitioning into this conversation about the future of the conservative movement. Just a real brief anecdote. Several of us from TPPF and some other groups were down on the border earlier this week. And to the person, every single Border Patrol agent we encountered, a couple dozen, said two things. Number one, the wall's working. Where there's a wall, it's working. Number two, would you please help us tell our story? That told me that as folks who are center-right, we do a poor job of articulating the truth.
Yeah.
And so there's a pitch to you to give us some advice on how to do a better job of that, both on that specific issue as well as all of the issues we care about.
Well, America's immigration system needs to attract the best and brightest, freedom-minded people from all over the world. The left likes to look at immigration as an international charity that's funded by the American taxpayer. What we do should make life for every American better. And we have incredible opportunity here. We're already the most generous nation in the world. Over 1 million can come every year legally into our country. And we need a legal system if we're going to do things that actually help our country prosper in the future. To do that, we need to control our borders. It's common sense. They told Trump he couldn't win an election if he talked about a wall. We found out people were ready for a wall. And I think it's done a lot to help define him. But as Republicans, we need to remind people that immigration is important to our future and prosperity, job creation for other Americans. We need to keep saying it. The media is not going to repeat it on our behalf. There's a lot of progress on the border. The media will not talk about it. They still talk about cages. But the future of conservatism, it relates to understanding what our country is and what it is that makes it great. A colleague of mine, Rachel Bovard, who I think went to the border with you, she and I wrote a book last year titled Conservative. The subtitle was Knowing What to Keep. What we want Americans to know is that conservatism begins with gratitude, being grateful for all the blessings that we have and being passionate about keeping those things for ourselves and the next generation. But to understand how this country became great, we need to know what made it great. And those are conservative principles like federalism, like the focus on states, like capitalism, like our covenant of we the people is totally different than other nations where they are the subject of their government. Our government works for us. If we just understand some of the basics that made this country so different, then we'll know what to keep, and then conservatism will be something that people will want in the future. But what we want to do is convince the country that Conservative ideas make life better for everyone. Black, white, poor, rich, everyone. And it's true. We've got the data to back it up. We need to be better at communication. I'm frustrated with the national media, but the good news, most people get their news now in some digital form, podcast, on the internet, and we have just as much opportunity to compete there as anyone else. And a lot of the good news and good data that we use comes from Texas public policy. It's copied by other states. We use it in Washington. But I'll just end with the fact, I've worked with national think tanks, as you mentioned, but it's the policy organizations on the ground at the state level that are going to turn this country towards those conservative principles, because it represents decentralized power. And that's where freedom comes from. If we let things go to Washington, we're not going to be free, as we see in healthcare, as we see in education and all these other things. Let's move it back to the states. Let states compete. So I'm excited about what you're doing here in Texas public policy, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it for a few minutes.
Thank you. Governor Patrick, last question, very, very fitting based on what Senator DeMint just said, and I didn't pay him to say that. All eyes are on Texas.
Yes.
As they should be. And if all eyes are on Texas because of what's going on politically, culturally, socially, economically in the country, then those of you who are the policymakers in Texas right now have a lot of eyes on you. You're one of the leaders of the conservative movement, not just in Texas, but nationally. So sort of a two-part question, what's the future of conservatism in Texas and beyond? And because we always like to sort of end on the practical here at TPPF,
Sure.
What advice would you give us, whether we're at TPPF or members of the audience, all ages, from all parts of the state and beyond, to do our part to make sure that we are living lives of gratitude and bringing people to this movement?
So first of all, we've added 10 million people since George Bush became president in 2000 to today. 10 million people. We were 18 million people in 2000, Senator, and we are pushing 29 million. And we're forecast to add 15 million people more by 2045. 15 million more. Now, 2045, it's only 7 sessions away, okay? We only vote on bills the last 2 months. That's 14 months. So from a practical standpoint, I'm a math guy. 14 months to get it right. So first step, we have to have the right people in the right place to get it right. That's first and foremost. Number two, I like to say about all the people who have come to Texas that no one's ever moved here, Senator. They arrive here and Texas moves into them. So it's up to us.
Vote like Texans when they get here.
Yeah, and that's the key. We've got to get them to vote like Texans on these policies, because at the end of the day, and I want to hear Dennis Prager. Many of you are familiar with PragerU and Dennis Prager, who's brilliant. And what he really talked about in his speech, and that's why I want to attribute it to him, was the left. And we're not talking about politics here. Keep us safe.
I didn't mean to make you so gun shy.
Okay, that's right. But the left is really focused on chaos. You know, in the book of Genesis, God talked about creation 3 times. God came to bring order. Whether it's man over animal, whether it's the 10 Commandments, give us order. And the left, whether it's 62 genders, whether it's open borders, whether it's taxing and taking all of your money because you've been successful, whatever, it's chaos. Whether it's Antifa or those 11 people or however many left in their debates. And so what's important for us is to teach our young people, in our schools, in our families, and to be our own personal ambassador of what has made Texas great and America great. Don't leave it up to someone else to do it. We have a responsibility at the state level to do that in our curriculum and our education system. So from a practical standpoint, that's where we are. The other part of that, and I was having this discussion just this week off, because some of the anchors at Fox have time on their hands because they're, doing debate. I mean, they're covering the circus up there, and so they're not working as much. And we're having this discussion about where the future of conservatism goes. And there's this talk about, well, one day Texas, it's inevitable, will be a Democrat state because of the Hispanic majority. The Hispanic family, they are pro-life. They are pro-school choice. They are pro-economic opportunity. They are pro-religious freedom. They are pro-secure border over law and order. And we as a group of conservatives, I won't say Republican Party, we as conservatives have to be sure that message is out of who we are as conservatives, to be sure that people say those are the values that are important to me. And in that respect, I think that's how we protect what we have. And I will say this, as conservatives, we are independent spirits. My goodness, we are independents. It's the difference between conservatives and liberals and leftists. They kind of are groupthink. We're independents. But we must stand together. We must recognize when we have victories and celebrate them. But we must also say, as Bill Belichick says for in New England after every game, win or lose, we're on to Cincinnati or on to. We have to be ready to take the next session, the next issue, because we can always be better. And there are things that we didn't get done, for example, in session, like ending taxpayer-funded lobbying, like ethics reform. Both bills, I'm proud to say, the Senate passed out. And I'm not criticizing House members here, but it got through the Senate, okay? And we have a lot of great conservatives in the House, by the way, many are here today, who are just as frustrated about that as I am. So there's always more to be done. But let's remember, we're all on the same team. We are all on the same team. And we need to stand together, even where we have some shades of disagreement, because the people who are not conservative in this state, they are 180 degrees opposite of what you believe in and what you think. So let's not let anyone divide us, whether it's the mainstream media or people who are unhappy, and surely the left. We must stand together because the future of Texas depends on it, the future of the country depends on it, and the future of the world depends on it. And as our great friend Senator Donna Campbell always likes to say in her yellow dress, that little firecracker, we have to get it right because there's not another Texas to move to. Where would we go?
Thank you.
Excellent.
Governor Patrick, Senator DeMint, thank you so much. Y'all join me in celebrating this conversation with them.
Thank you.
Good job. Thank you. Yeah, you bet.
Great job. That was fun.